United Nations since only 1871, it was the rising force of Europe, ruled by the ambitious Kaiser Wilhelm II. Ever since he'd become emperor in 1888, the Kaiser had been determined to use Germany's new industrial muscle to create an overseas empire. To first win and then protect that empire, he needed to build a navy. The Kaiser's ambitions worried the British, and the two nations began to compete with each other in a naval arms race. In 1908, in an interview with the Daily Telegraph newspaper, the Kaiser claimed he was simply imitating the other imperial powers.
Germany is a young and growing empire. She has a worldwide commerce which is rapidly expanding, and to which the legitimate ambition of patriotic Germans refuses to assign any bounds. Germany must have a powerful fleet to protect that commerce.
Germany's emergence had reshaped the European map. Germany formed an alliance with the much older empire of Austria-Hungary. Together, these central powers now dominated the heart of Europe. But Austria's Habsburg dynasty was rotting from within. Even members of the royal family knew it.
The sense of self-importance which has always pervaded the Habsburgs weighs heavily over Austria and is the cause of its moral downfall.
Opposing Germany and Austria-Hungary was the so-called Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia. France had been racked by revolutions and defeated by the Prussians in the War of 1870. But Paris remained the most glamorous city on earth.
I shall ever remember it as a marvelous city where life is well worth living for 4 or 5 months every year, just to improve one's mind in an unrivaled intellectual and artistic atmosphere.
Russia was ruled over by the autocratic emperor, Tsar Nicholas II. The Russians had been defeated by Japan in the War of 1904 and 5, and this had provoked the first unsuccessful attempt at revolution. The bitterness of many Russians was summed up in a workers' petition to the Tsar.
We have become beggars. We have been oppressed. We are not recognized as human beings. We are treated as slaves. We have no strength at all, O Sovereign. We are approaching that terrible moment when death is better than the continuance of intolerable suffering.
But 6 years later, the Tsar and his appointed leaders believed the nation was back on track.
Every year of peace fortifies Russia, not only from the military and naval point of view, but also from the economic and financial.
By 1914, though the demands to curtail the Tsar's power were becoming louder, Russia was as strong as it had ever been. While Russia stood for the old, across the Atlantic stood the new, America. It was democratic, brash, optimistic, and thousands of miles from the disputes that plagued Europe. In his inaugural speech of 1905, the new president, Theodore Roosevelt, had laid out his vision of a blessed nation.
My fellow citizens, no people on earth have more cause to be thankful than ours. To us as a people, it has been granted to lay the foundations of our national life in a new continent. We are the heirs of the ages, and yet we have had to pay few of the penalties, which in old countries are exacted by the dead hand of a bygone civilization.
In 1914, America was a world away from the conflict that was about to engulf Europe. On July the 28th, exactly 1 month after the assassination of Crown Prince Ferdinand by, as the Austrians claimed, Serbian nationalists, Austria declared war on Serbia in revenge. Austrians were jubilant, but Europe's complex set of alliances would trigger an unstoppable catastrophe.
There was an immediate feeling that something was really going to happen which would cause all the pillars of Europe, as it were, to rock. The whole business of the European relationships began to come into play. The fact that Russia was aligned to France, that we were aligned to France, that Germany was aligned to Austria-Hungary. And these relationships, far from halting the move to war, in fact, really, in a sense, almost conditioned the move to war.
As Austrian troops moved into Serbia, the Germans warned Russia that if it went to war in support of the Serbs, Germany would go to war against the Russians. On the 30th of July, Austrian guns began to bombard the Serbian capital, Belgrade. The Serbs turned to Russia for help.
The Russians were the protectors of the Serbs and indeed the Slavic people in the Balkans, and they could not stand on the sidelines when Austria was threatening Serbia. And so Russia was drawn into the international crisis.
Like the Austrians, Russian soldiers could hardly wait to fight.
The spirit of the soldiers is excellent. They are animated by a firm belief in the righteousness and honor of their cause, and so there is no ground for nervousness or unease.
Germany now declared war on Russia, but it had other motives. Its aggression had led to it being boxed in by the alliance between Russia, France, and Britain. War had come at the right time.
People began thinking of what might be ahead. On the streets, reservists could be seen everywhere. It seemed as if people were ready to fight the world at the drop of a hat. I wondered whether this outward show of martial spirit was like whistling in the dark or whether it was genuine. Nobody really could imagine what a real war would bring us.
Provoked by Germany, France now mobilized its troops. The French commander-in-chief, Joseph Joffre, drilled his men into order. But some felt only confusion.
War. Everyone knows it. Everyone says so. It would be madness not to believe it. War, the great European war. No, it can't be true.
German troops headed for the border with Belgium. Germany's strategists had concluded that a swift move through Belgium provided the softest route to break into France and capture Paris. On August the 3rd, Bank Holiday Monday, the British looked on in disbelief.
This morning at breakfast, we learned that war is formally declared between France and Germany. Germany has declared to Belgium that if her troops are allowed to pass unmolested through Belgian territory, she will protect her interests in the treaty at the end of the war. Belgium has indignantly refused, and the King of the Belgians has appealed to King George for aid.
There was a huge tide of sympathy for the Belgians in Britain, and a mass of people who said, for God's sake, are we going to stand by and not do the decent thing?
On August the 4th, the German army marched into Belgium.
At last, I have got my orders. Dear Mother, please try to keep constantly before your mind what I have realized. If at this time we think of ourselves and of those that belong to us, we shall be petty and weak. We must have a broad outlook and think of our nation, our fatherland, of God.
At midnight on August the 4th, Britain declared war on Germany. By now, all the great nations of Europe had been sucked into the conflict. But the established view was that it would all be over by Christmas.
The situation is absolutely unparalleled in the history of the world. It is estimated that when the war begins, 40 millions of men will be engaged in the conflict.
I don't think Britain really had a choice. They were a superpower. They were the superpower of Europe. If there was going to be a big showdown in Europe, surely they had to be part of it. They couldn't just sit there and watch Europe implode.
There was an atmosphere then of almost jubilation. Now we're going to fight and do something useful. We didn't realise what war really involved.
They were enemies with England, and that was all that was interesting to the boy of that age, and he was going to fight for England.
The German army cut a swathe through Belgium. On August the 14th, the Germans entered the capital, Brussels. As civilians tried to resist, the German army took its revenge, in one instance executing 600 innocent Belgians. Some German soldiers began to fear what they had unleashed.
To see those frightened men, women and children was a really terrible sight. By now the German soldier was frightened too, expecting to be shot from all sides.
Ordinary Belgians had to flee.
There are families of 7, 8 children walking along the road. The railway is their only hope. The youngsters don't understand. The others ask where they will be taken. It's an indescribable mess.
As the Germans marched on, Britain was about to fight its first major European war for 99 years. For over 100 years, ever since the Battle of Trafalgar, Britain's navy had dominated the sea. In July 1914, it lined up at Spithead off the Isle of Wight for review by King George V. It was an impressive sight, but Britain's army had always been seen as much less important than the navy, and it was far smaller than its continental rivals. Now, in the autumn of 1914, the Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, told the people of Britain and its empire they were facing the greatest emergency in their history. Every man and woman must do their duty.
I remember in particular one Scottish regiment in full kilts, and it was absolutely thrilling to see a Scottish regiment on the march to the bagpipes. And there's something about the way the kilts were all moving together, which thrilled me and all of us.
Lord Kitchener of Khartoum was put in charge of raising a volunteer army, initially of 100,000 men. By the end of 1914, 1 million had joined up.
I enlisted as a volunteer in 1914, September the 2nd. Myself and about 30 of my colleagues that I work with joined en masse.
As the new young soldiers left for the front from all over the empire, their families left behind could only wait and hope.
Now, dearest Mav, keep your heart up and trust in Providence. It is a great and glorious thing to be going to fight for England. The greatest thing you can do for me is to keep cheerful and don't forget to write often and tell me all the scraps of news.
Husbands and wives dreaded the moment of parting.
I sit and stare stupidly at his luggage by the wall. Then he takes a book out of his pocket. You see, your Shakespeare sonnets are already where they always will be. Shall I read you some? His face is grey and his mouth trembles. but his voice is quiet and steady, and soon I slip to the floor and sit between his knees, and while he reads, his hand falls over my shoulder. So, talking and crying and loving in each other's arms, we fall asleep.
The British Expeditionary Force was sent to Belgium to block the advancing German army. On the 23rd of August, it literally collided with the Germans at the town of Mons. Their first day of action astonished.